£99.7 billion. That's the value of trade between the UK and China right now. But here's the shocking part. Britain runs a £42 billion deficit on this. For every pound the UK sells to China, it buys almost 3 times as much back to its market. And this isn't just about toys or cheap gadgets, but everything that keeps the UK running. Think about that for a moment. The food on supermarket shelves, the batteries powering electric cars, the solar panels on rooftops, and the phones in our pockets are all increasingly tied to one country. And it's not Britain, it's China. This isn't just about trade. The UK is actually getting more dependent on China, and this dependence comes at a cost that could one day mean the UK government no longer has the authority to call the shots on its own economy. However, behind the numbers, there's even a bigger story covered in quiet influence, strategic investments, and a game of power between both countries that's already happening before our very eyes. What if the biggest threat to Britain's economic independence is coming from China in the most unsuspecting way? Well, let's break this down a little further. In early 2025, official figures showed that trade between the UK and China reached approximately £99.7 billion, increasing China's position as the UK's 5th largest trading partner. On the surface, that sounds like progress. But when you dig deeper, you find out that this imbalance gets even more alarming. Out of that £99.7 billion, the total UK exports to China amounted to £28.8 billion in the 4 quarters to the end of the first quarter of 2025, while the imports from China rose to £70.8 billion. That's billions of pounds flowing out of Britain at a massive scale. You might want to ask, what exactly is the UK buying? Well, many consider it the backbone of the country's green future, ranging from solar panels and electric vehicle batteries to raw materials for the energy transition and even basic consumer goods. Today, it is no longer news that China produces 80% of the world's solar panels and controls over 70% of the production of global EV batteries. In other words, the UK's green revolution is getting powered by Beijing. But this dependence didn't happen overnight. It crept in quietly over the last 2 decades. First came the attraction of low-cost manufacturing. Many British companies that were once squeezed by rising costs at home began outsourcing their production to China. This was also partly because supermarkets and tech companies wanted cheaper goods and components. However, when the COVID-19 pandemic spread in 2020, the world saw the price of this seemingly harmless bargain. During the pandemic, the UK faced severe shortages of basic medical supplies like masks, gloves, and even ventilator parts. Why? Much of that supply came from faraway China. It was a wake-up call for the UK leadership at the time, who promised to take back control and make the UK more self-sufficient. However, fast forward to today, and the numbers tell a different story. Instead of reducing its dependence on countries like China, the UK has doubled down on it. The imports of Chinese-made electronics have risen by 25% since 2023. Sales of Chinese electric vehicles in Europe also jumped by 55%, with brands like BYD and SAIC making significant inroads into the British market. And here's the twist. China is taking its conquest of the UK right to its finished sector market. For example, China currently holds more than 69% of the global supply of rare earth minerals, which are essential for wind turbines, electric motors, and smartphones. So, if Beijing wanted to tighten its tap, Britain's energy and tech sectors would feel the squeeze almost immediately. Meanwhile, what's happening to British manufacturing? Remember when the UK had booming steel parts, car factories, and assembly lines? Well, many of these have either been shut down or scaled back simply because they cannot compete with China's low production costs and massive subsidies. In 2022, the UK's indigenous EV battery maker, Britishvolt, filed for bankruptcy. Why? Lack of funding, high costs of production, and competition from Chinese firms that dominate the global supply chain. So what happens when the future of a country's energy, transport, and tech depends on another country that doesn't share the same values or interests? Apparently, that's the question Britain faces now, and trade is just the surface. Beneath it lies something even more worrying: ownership. While UK politicians talked about a global Britain, investors from China were busy buying Britain. From state-backed funds and real estate deals to infrastructure takeovers, they were buying it all. Take China Investment Corporation, Beijing's sovereign wealth fund with total assets of $1.33 trillion and net assets of $1.24 trillion as contained in its 2023 annual report. Over the last decade, CIC and other Chinese funds have quietly bought up stakes in UK infrastructure. One of the most significant examples is the London Heathrow Airport. Today, China Investment Corporation still owns approximately a 10% stake in Heathrow, which it acquired in 2012. Consider the scenario where the gateway to Britain is partly controlled by a foreign state. But it doesn't stop there. Back in 2017, Chinese investors acquired a 90% stake in the UK National Grid's gas pipelines business in a £13.8 billion deal. That means a key part of Britain's energy network that is responsible for delivering gas to millions of homes across the country is largely in foreign hands. When you add that to CIC's 8.68% stake in Thames Water, a much bigger picture emerges. Utilities, energy, and critical infrastructure are increasingly controlled from Beijing. And then there's real estate. When you walk through London's financial district and look up at the glass towers, many of those structures are owned by Chinese firms or state-backed funds. From the Royal Mint Court to Canary Wharf, money from China has gone into prime property. For a country like China, these are not just about making a profit, but having strategic footholds in the heart of Britain's economy. The story becomes even more significant when we take a close look at the manufacturing and logistics industry. As part of its extensive Belt and Road Initiative, China has made several investments and partnerships across British ports, shipping routes, and industrial parks. Why does this matter? Having control over ports means influencing the flow of trade, which is essentially the lifeblood of the economy. And it's not just about old infrastructure. China is also investing heavily in the future with its battery gigafactories, EV technology, and renewable energy projects. Recently, the UK government unveiled a major investment plan of $1.35 billion in funding for the Chinese battery technology company Envision, AESC, to support the construction of a gigafactory in Sunderland. Sounds like good news for UK jobs, right? But if the UK's EV future gets more dependent on Chinese-owned plants, what leverage does that create? No matter how you put it, these investments come with some sort of strings attached, and they give Beijing more political leverage. If Britain ever takes a stance that China doesn't like on human rights, Taiwan, or trade restrictions, there's a risk of retaliation, not with missiles, but with money. Beijing could threaten to withdraw investment, disrupt supply chains, or even utilize its influence in critical sectors to exert pressure on the UK government.